In the summer of 1943, the war over the Pacific Ocean had become a brutal contest of distance, endurance, and survival. Thousands of miles of ocean separated scattered islands that had suddenly become some of the most strategic locations on Earth. Every airstrip, every jungle ridge, every patch of coral runway could determine who controlled the skies. For the United States Army Air Forces, long-range bombers were the backbone of this enormous battlefield. They were expected to fly farther than any fighter, carry heavy bomb loads, and survive in skies filled with enemy interceptors. Among these aircraft, one machine had earned a reputation unlike any other. It was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the most famous bombers of the Second World War. The B-17 was designed to do something remarkable for its time. It could fly long distances, absorb incredible damage, and still bring its crew home. With multiple defensive gun positions and a rugged airframe, it became known as a bomber that could fight its way through enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Crews trusted the B-17 because countless stories circulated across airfields about aircraft returning to base with shredded wings, damaged engines, and entire sections of fuselage torn apart. But not every B-17 inspired confidence. Some aircraft seemed to carry a strange history with them. One of these was a tired, worn-out bomber with the tail number 412266. Mechanics and ground crews had a nickname for it, though many of them said it half jokingly and half seriously. They called it Old 666. By 1943, the aircraft had already lived a rough life. It was an early B-17E model, older than many of the other bombers now arriving in the Pacific. Over months of hard service, the airplane had been damaged, repaired, and patched together so many times that it no longer looked like a proud combat machine. Panels didn't quite match, equipment had been stripped out, systems had been modified again and again. Eventually, the aircraft was pushed aside. It sat in what crews called the boneyard, a quiet corner of the airfield where tired or damaged aircraft waited for parts to be removed. In wartime, nothing went to waste. If a bomber could no longer fly reliably, mechanics would salvage radios, engines, machine guns, and anything else that could keep other aircraft in the air. Old 666 looked like it was heading toward that fate. Ground crews would walk past it every day. The plane carried scars from earlier missions. Some of its systems barely worked, and stories began to spread about it. People said the aircraft was unlucky. Some said crews who flew it had experienced strange mechanical failures. Others said it simply brought bad fortune. In wartime, superstition spreads quickly. Pilots were willing to fly dangerous missions, but they preferred not to tempt fate. Many of them quietly refused to take Old 666 into the air. As newer aircraft arrived, the old B-17 sat forgotten on the edge of the field, slowly turning from a combat bomber into a source of spare parts. Then one day, a pilot noticed it. Captain Jay Zeamer was not like most officers in the bomber force. Zeamer had already built a reputation for being stubborn, highly skilled, and unusually independent. He had little patience for bureaucracy and even less patience for limits placed on how he flew missions. He also had a reputation for something else. He liked doing things his own way. When Zeamer first saw the battered B-17 sitting in the boneyard, he didn't see a cursed airplane. He saw something else entirely. He saw an opportunity. The Pacific Air War demanded aircraft that could travel enormous distances. Reconnaissance missions in particular were incredibly dangerous. A lone bomber might be sent hundreds of miles into enemy territory to photograph airfields, map coastlines, or track Japanese troop movements. These missions were vital, but they were also some of the most dangerous flights in the entire theater of war. Often, these aircraft had no fighter escort. That meant if enemy fighters intercepted them, the bomber crew would be completely on their own. Zeamer began to imagine something different. What if a bomber could defend itself better than any other aircraft in the Pacific? What if it carried more guns, more firepower, and a crew that knew exactly how to use them? Most officers would have requested a new aircraft. Zeamer did the opposite. He asked for the abandoned one. Mechanics were surprised when they heard the request. Some thought Zeamer was joking. Others warned him that the aircraft had too many problems to be trusted in combat. But Zeamer insisted. If the plane was going to be scrapped anyway, he argued, then there was nothing to lose by trying to rebuild it. Eventually, the request was approved. The moment the decision was made, old 666's fate changed. Instead of being stripped for parts, it was pulled out of the boneyard and rolled back into a maintenance hangar. Mechanics who had once ignored the aircraft now found themselves working on it again, patching holes, checking engines, repairing systems that had been neglected for months. But Zeamer had bigger plans than simple repairs. He wanted to turn the old bomber into something no one had ever seen before. Over the following weeks, the aircraft began to change. Gun positions were modified, new mounts were installed, equipment was rearranged. Zeamer worked closely with mechanics, suggesting alterations that would allow the crew to fire in directions that normal bombers couldn't cover. Little by little, the abandoned aircraft began to transform. Pilots and ground crews started to notice something unusual happening inside the hangar. The battered B-17 that had once been considered unlucky was slowly turning into one of the most heavily armed bombers in the Pacific. At the same time, Zeamer began assembling a crew. He wasn't looking for ordinary volunteers. He wanted men who were willing to fly the most dangerous missions in the theater. Some of them were experienced gunners. Others were specialists who had already survived intense combat. Like Zeamer himself, many of them had reputations for being independent, stubborn, and fearless. Before long, the group had earned a nickname. They called themselves the Eager Beavers. The name sounded playful, but their mission was anything but easy. They knew the aircraft they were preparing might soon fly alone over enemy territory, facing Japanese fighters without help. But none of them walked away. In fact, the more people talked about the so-called cursed bomber, the more determined the crew became to prove everyone wrong. What began as a forgotten aircraft in the corner of an airfield was about to become something else entirely. The patched-together B-17 with the strange reputation was slowly evolving into a flying gunship. And soon, it would be sent on a mission so dangerous that many commanders believed no bomber could survive it. But Captain Jay Zeamer and his crew had already made their decision. If the aircraft was cursed, they were going to take that curse straight into the heart of the war. By the time the battered B-17 was pulled out of the boneyard, most people on the airfield assumed it would simply be repaired and returned to routine service. But Captain Jay Zeamer had no intention of using the aircraft in the ordinary way. He believed the old bomber could become something entirely different, something far more dangerous to enemy fighters. The aircraft, officially a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, had been designed with strong defensive armament. Standard versions carried multiple 50-caliber machine guns placed in the nose, dorsal turret, ventral position, and tail. The idea behind the design was simple. If enemy fighters attacked, the bomber could surround itself with overlapping fields of fire. That defensive power was one of the reasons the aircraft earned its nickname, the Flying Fortress. But Zeamer believed it could be even stronger. The Pacific theater of World War II presented unique problems for bomber crews. Missions often required aircraft to fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, far beyond the range of friendly fighter escorts. When Japanese interceptors appeared, a bomber crew could suddenly find itself completely alone. In those moments, survival depended entirely on the guns mounted to the aircraft and the men who operated them. Zeamer began studying every corner of the aircraft. He examined blind spots where enemy fighters could approach without being hit by defensive fire. He talked with mechanics and gunners about possible improvements. Slowly, an idea began to take shape. Instead of relying only on the standard gun positions, they would add more, much more. Over the next several weeks, the hangar where the bomber sat became a workshop for experimentation. Mechanics removed equipment that Zeamer considered unnecessary and replaced it with additional weapon mounts. Some guns were repositioned to improve their firing angles. Others were installed in places where no gun had been placed before. The goal was simple but ambitious: eliminate as many blind spots as possible. If enemy fighters approached from the front, there would be guns waiting. If they attacked from the sides, the bomber would answer with heavy fire. Even positions that had once been weakly defended were now reinforced with additional machine guns. By the time the work was finished, the aircraft carried an astonishing number of weapons: 19 machine guns. For a bomber of its size, that level of firepower was extraordinary. The aircraft was no longer just a reconnaissance platform or a standard bomber. It had become something closer to a flying gunship. One of the most unusual modifications appeared in the nose of the aircraft. Normally, the front of the B-17 was designed mainly for the bombardier, who operated the bomb site during bombing missions. But Zeamer had something else in mind. He arranged for a forward-facing machine gun to be mounted in a way that allowed it to fire directly ahead. This meant that if an enemy fighter approached head-on, the bomber could fire back before the attacker even reached its normal gun range. It was a simple idea, but one that dramatically increased the aircraft's defensive power. As the aircraft changed, Zeamer began gathering the men who would fly with him. Every bomber depended on teamwork. A B-17 crew usually included a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineers, and multiple gunners. Each position required training, discipline, and absolute trust between crew members. In combat, a single mistake could destroy the entire aircraft. But Zeamer wasn't just looking for skilled airmen. He wanted people who were willing to push limits. Some of the men who joined the crew were experienced veterans of combat missions. Others were known for their calm behavior under pressure. Many of them had reputations for volunteering for difficult assignments. What united them was a willingness to fly a mission that most airmen would avoid. Among these men was a quiet but highly respected bombardier named Joseph Sarnoski. Sarnoski had already flown dangerous missions and was known for his focus and determination. The bombardier's job required precision and courage. During bombing runs, the bombardier often remained in the nose of the aircraft, one of the most exposed positions in the entire bomber. If enemy fighters attacked from the front, he would be among the first to face them. But Sarnoski accepted the role without hesitation. As the crew assembled, their unusual personalities quickly became obvious around the airfield. Many of them were known for bending rules or challenging authority. Some officers considered them difficult, others simply called them unconventional. Before long, the group adopted a nickname for themselves. They called their team the Eager Beavers. The name reflected their attitude. They were eager to fly missions that others avoided, eager to push their aircraft harder than regulations allowed, and eager to prove that their modified bomber could survive anything the war threw at it. Training flights began soon after the aircraft was ready. At first, other pilots watched with curiosity as the strange B-17 lifted off the runway. From a distance, it looked like any other bomber, but those who knew about the modifications understood that it was something different. Inside the aircraft, the crew practiced coordinated defense against fighter attacks. Each gunner had a specific field of fire, but they also trained to shift quickly if enemy aircraft approached from unexpected angles. Communication between positions became critical. A warning shouted over the intercom could give another gunner the few seconds needed to bring his weapon into position. Again and again, they rehearsed scenarios where multiple fighters attacked at once. Zeamer pushed the aircraft hard during these flights. He tested how it handled with the extra weight of ammunition and guns. He practiced tight turns and sudden maneuvers that could throw off attacking fighters. The aircraft had once been considered unreliable, but under Zeamer's control, it began to prove something remarkable. It could still fight. Ground crews who had once joked about the plane's bad luck began to notice something surprising. The aircraft that had been labeled cursed was now flying regularly. It was surviving rough training flights and returning to base again and again. Slowly, attitudes started to change. Some mechanics began to believe that maybe the plane had simply been waiting for the right crew. Still, no one could ignore the reality of what they were preparing for. The mission Zeamer and his crew were training for would send them deep into enemy territory. There would be no friendly fighters nearby. If Japanese interceptors discovered them, the eager Beavers would face the full force of enemy air defenses alone. The modified bomber might carry 19 guns, but it was still just one aircraft. Against an entire squadron of fighters, the odds would be terrifying. Yet every member of the crew understood what they had signed up for. They believed their aircraft was ready. They believed their training had prepared them, and soon the moment would come when their flying gunship would have to prove itself in the skies above the Pacific. By mid-1943, the air war in the Pacific had reached a dangerous turning point. Allied forces were pushing slowly north through a chain of heavily defended islands, and every movement depended on one critical thing: information. Commanders needed to know where Japanese airfields were located, where ships were moving, and how enemy defenses were arranged across the vast island chains. One of the most important targets for reconnaissance at the time was the large island of Bougainville Island. Bougainville sat in the northern part of the Solomon Islands and had become a major stronghold for Japanese forces. Airfields built there allowed Japanese fighters to threaten Allied operations across the region. Before any large attack could be planned, the Allied command needed detailed aerial photographs of the island, its coastlines, airstrips, gun positions, and supply routes. Getting those photographs, however, was incredibly dangerous. Bougainville was deep inside enemy-controlled territory. Japanese radar stations and lookout posts constantly scanned the skies for approaching aircraft. Fighter squadrons were stationed nearby and could be airborne within minutes of detecting an intruder. Any reconnaissance plane flying over the island would almost certainly be intercepted. Yet the mission had to be done. The task of flying that mission was assigned to the unusual bomber commanded by Jay Zeamer and his crew of eager Beavers. Their aircraft, the heavily modified B-17, known as Old 666, B-17E Flying Fortress, had been prepared specifically for dangerous solo operations like this one. Instead of carrying a large bomb load, the plane was equipped with cameras and extra defensive guns. The goal was not to attack the island, but to map it in precise detail. But there was one problem that every man on board understood. They would be flying alone. Normally, bombers operating over enemy territory were protected by fighter escorts whenever possible. But the distance to Bougainville was simply too great for most Allied fighters to cover. Even if escorts were available for part of the journey, the reconnaissance aircraft would eventually be on its own. Once over the island, if enemy fighters appeared, there would be no one to help them. Despite that risk, Zeamer's crew accepted the assignment without hesitation. Early on the morning of June 16, 1943, the bomber sat on the runway as the engines warmed up. The The powerful engines of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress roared to life one by one, shaking the aircraft's metal frame. Ground crews moved around the plane, making final checks, ensuring that ammunition belts were loaded and cameras were ready. Inside the aircraft, each crew member moved to his station. The navigator prepared maps and calculated the long route over open ocean. The radio operator tested communication equipment. Gunners checked their weapons carefully, feeding long belts of .5 caliber ammunition into the machine guns that lined the aircraft. In the nose of the bomber sat the bombardier, Joseph Sarnoski. For this mission, Sarnoski's role was slightly different from a traditional bombing run. Instead of focusing only on the bomb site, he would also help operate the cameras used to photograph the island below. But he also knew that his position in the nose placed him directly in the path of any fighter that attacked from the front. It was one of the most exposed places in the aircraft. When everything was ready, Zeamer pushed the throttles forward. The heavy bomber began to roll down the runway, gathering speed as its engines thundered against the morning air. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted off the ground and climbed steadily into the sky, leaving the base behind as it headed toward the open Pacific. For hours, the flight continued over empty ocean. Below them stretched nothing but endless blue water. The crew settled into the quiet rhythm of a long-distance mission. Some men watched the skies through gun sights. Others monitored instruments or reviewed navigation calculations. Inside the bomber, the sound of the engines created a constant roar that filled the aircraft. But everyone knew the quiet would not last forever. Eventually, the dark outline of Bougainville appeared on the horizon. The island rose from the sea like a wall of jungle-covered mountains. Thick clouds drifted over its ridges, and somewhere beneath those clouds were Japanese airfields and military bases. Zeamer guided the bomber toward its target area while the camera equipment was prepared. To complete the mission, the aircraft would have to fly in a precise pattern across the island so that overlapping photographs could later be assembled into detailed maps. That meant flying straight and level for long periods, and flying straight over enemy territory was extremely dangerous. As the aircraft approached the island, tension inside the bomber began to rise. Every gunner scanned the sky more carefully. The radio operator listened for signals that might indicate Japanese fighters had already been alerted. For several minutes, nothing happened. The cameras began taking photographs as the aircraft passed over the island's coastline. Rivers, jungles, and small airstrips appeared beneath the bomber as it continued its mapping route. From a distance, the island looked peaceful, almost untouched. But the crew knew better. Somewhere below, enemy observers might already be watching them. Then, not long after the aircraft began its photographic run, the first warning came. One of the crew members spotted movement in the distance, small shapes rising quickly from the horizon. At first, they looked like tiny dots against the sky, but those dots were growing larger. The shapes soon became unmistakable. Japanese fighters were climbing rapidly toward the lone bomber. Within minutes, the crew could clearly see the approaching aircraft, sleek, fast fighters designed specifically to destroy bombers like theirs. These were the deadly interceptors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the feared Mitsubishi A6M Zero. And there were not just one or two. More fighters were appearing in the sky. The eager Beavers suddenly realized the reality of their situation. Their mission had taken them directly into the heart of enemy defenses, and now the defenders were coming. The modified bomber with 19 machine guns was about to face its first real test. Alone in the sky above Bougainville, with no friendly fighters nearby, the crew prepared for the moment they had trained for. The Japanese fighters were closing in fast.
As the dark shapes in the sky grew larger, there was no longer any doubt about what was coming. The fighters climbing toward the lone bomber were fast, agile, and built for one purpose: destroying heavy aircraft. Within minutes, the crew could clearly see the distinctive wings and narrow fuselages of the Japanese interceptors. They were Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, some of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific during World War II. Inside the bomber, every crew member moved instantly into combat readiness. The calm rhythm of the reconnaissance flight disappeared, replaced by sharp commands and quick movements. Gunners tightened their grips on the handles of their machine guns. Ammunition belts rattled as they were fed into the weapons. Eyes scanned the sky in every direction. From the cockpit, Jay Zeamer could already see how many fighters were approaching. It wasn't just a patrol, it was a squadron. Japanese fighters had launched from nearby airfields and were now racing toward the intruding bomber from multiple directions. Some approached from above, diving down toward the aircraft. Others climbed from below, preparing to attack from the sides. Within moments, the sky around the bomber filled with enemy aircraft. The first attack came quickly. A Zero dove out of the sun, racing straight toward the nose of the bomber. Its cannons flashed as it opened fire, sending streams of bullets toward the cockpit. Tracers streaked through the air, flashing past the windows. But this time, the bomber was not defenseless. From the nose of the aircraft, Joseph Sarnoski swung his machine gun toward the attacking fighter. The modified forward gun that Zeamer had insisted on installing now proved its value. As the Zero closed in, Sarnoski fired a burst directly at it. Bright tracer rounds shot forward through the air. The Japanese pilot suddenly faced a problem he hadn't expected. Instead of approaching a bomber that could only defend itself at close range, he was flying directly into heavy gunfire. The fighter broke away sharply, pulling out of its attack. But the other fighters were already moving in. Zeros began circling the bomber like wolves surrounding a wounded animal. They attacked from multiple angles, trying to find gaps in the aircraft's defenses. Some dived from above, firing their cannons on the wings and engines. Others approached from below, targeting the tail. The sky exploded with gunfire. Machine guns from the bomber roared as every gunner opened fire. The air around the aircraft filled with tracer rounds moving in every direction. Each time a fighter approached, one or more gunners responded with bursts of .50 caliber fire. Inside the bomber, the noise was overwhelming. The roar of engines mixed with the thunder of machine guns and the violent shaking of the aircraft as bullets struck its metal skin. Pieces of aluminum tore away under enemy fire. Instruments rattled in their panels as the plane maneuvered to avoid incoming attacks. Zeamer gripped the controls tightly. Despite the danger, he began flying the bomber in ways most pilots would never attempt with such a large aircraft. Instead of maintaining a straight course, he banked sharply and made sudden turns, forcing the attacking fighters to constantly adjust their approach angles. Every maneuver helped give his gunners a better chance to fire back. The battle quickly became chaotic. Zeros attacked again and again, sometimes only seconds apart. One fighter would dive away after firing, while another appeared from a completely different direction. The bomber seemed to be surrounded by fast-moving shapes flashing across the sky. Yet the modified B-17 continued to fight. Each time a fighter came close, multiple guns answered with defensive fire. Tracers streaked across the sky like glowing lines, forcing enemy pilots to pull away or risk flying straight into the deadly streams of bullets. But the bomber was not escaping damage. Enemy rounds slammed into the fuselage, windows shattered, fragments of metal tore through the interior. Some bullets ripped through control cables and equipment compartments. The aircraft shuddered repeatedly as more hits landed. During one of the attacks, cannon shells struck near the nose of the aircraft. Shrapnel tore through the front section of the bomber, sending fragments of metal flying inside. In that moment, Joseph Sarnoski was badly wounded defending the forward gun position. Despite his injuries, he refused to abandon his post. Another group of Zeros was already diving toward the bomber from the front, hoping to destroy the cockpit and end the fight.
Sarnosky knew that if those fighters reached raining challenge, the aircraft might not survive the attack, so he stayed at the gun. With tremendous effort, he continued firing at the approaching fighters, sending burst after burst toward them. The stream of bullets forced the attackers to break away before they could line up their shots. His actions protected the cockpit and the pilot struggling to keep the aircraft in the air. Meanwhile, the battle around the bomber continued to rage. Zeros swept past the aircraft again and again, firing their cannons and machine guns. Some passed so close that the crew could see the faces of the enemy pilots for a brief instant before the fighters flashed by. Inside the cockpit, Jay Zeamer was also wounded during the attack. Shrapnel and bullets struck parts of the aircraft around him, injuring him severely. Blood ran down his arms and legs as he fought to maintain control of the bomber. But he refused to give up the controls. For more than 40 minutes, the fight continued high above Bougainville Island. The lone bomber and its crew battled wave after wave of intercepting fighters. The aircraft was scarred with bullet holes, its systems damaged, and crew members wounded. Yet the flying fortress refused to fall from the sky. Every gun that could still fire continued to defend the aircraft. Eventually, something unexpected began to happen. The attacking fighters started to break away. Some had taken damage from the bomber's defensive fire. Others had simply run low on ammunition or fuel after the prolonged battle. One by one, the Zeros began turning away from the fight, leaving the battered bomber alone in the sky once more. The aircraft was barely holding together. Smoke drifted from damaged sections of the fuselage. Parts of the plane were torn apart by gunfire. Several crew members were wounded, and the cockpit itself had taken heavy damage. But the bomber was still flying. Against overwhelming odds, the heavily armed aircraft had survived a battle against an entire squadron of fighters. And now, somehow, Jay Zeamer still had to guide the shattered plane hundreds of miles back across the Pacific Ocean.
For a few moments after the last fighter disappeared into the distance, the sky around the battered bomber became strangely quiet. The thunder of machine guns faded, replaced once again by the steady roar of the engines. But inside the aircraft, the situation was far from calm. The heavily damaged bomber drifted through the air above Bougainville Island, its metal skin torn apart by dozens of bullet holes. Sections of the fuselage were shredded, control cables had been damaged, equipment panels hung open where cannon shells had ripped through the aircraft. The crew of the modified old 666 B-17E Flying Fortress quickly realized just how close they had come to destruction. Smoke drifted through parts of the aircraft. Some gun positions had been disabled during the battle. Several crew members were wounded, and the medical supplies on board were limited. Yet the most difficult challenge was still ahead of them. They were hundreds of miles from home. Inside the cockpit, Captain Jay Zeamer was struggling to remain conscious. During the fierce battle with the Japanese fighters, fragments of metal and bullets had struck him multiple times. Blood covered parts of the cockpit as he continued gripping the controls. The aircraft itself had also taken serious damage. Some instruments were no longer working properly. Parts of the control system responded slowly or unpredictably. Every movement of the plane required careful adjustments. Yet Zeamer refused to give up control. Despite his severe injuries, he continued flying the bomber away from the island and back toward friendly territory. Behind him, the rest of the crew moved quickly to stabilize the situation inside the aircraft. Gunners who had just spent nearly an hour firing their weapons now worked to help wounded crewmates. The radio operator attempted to send signals back to base, informing them that the aircraft was still in the air, but badly damaged. In the nose section of the bomber, the situation was especially tragic. Joseph Sarnosky had continued firing his gun during the battle, even after being gravely wounded by enemy fire. His determination to defend the aircraft had prevented several Japanese fighters from destroying the cockpit during the most dangerous moments of the attack. But the injuries he sustained were devastating.
Despite the crew's efforts to help him, Sarnowski had made the ultimate sacrifice during the fight that saved the aircraft and everyone inside it. The crew understood that without his actions, the battle might have ended very differently. Meanwhile, the long flight home had only begun. The damaged bomber slowly crossed the open Pacific, its engines pushing the wounded aircraft through the sky, mile after mile. At times, the plane shuddered violently as air rushed through holes torn in the fuselage. Crew members checked the engines constantly, knowing that if even one failed, the aircraft might not remain airborne. Inside the cockpit, Zeamer's condition grew worse. Loss of blood and exhaustion were taking their toll, yet he continued guiding the aircraft across the ocean. Every mile they traveled brought them closer to safety, but also demanded enormous concentration. With damaged controls and failing instruments, flying the bomber had become an exhausting test of skill and determination. Still, the aircraft continued moving forward. Eventually, after what must have felt like an endless journey, the coastline of friendly territory finally appeared on the horizon. For the wounded crew inside the aircraft, it was the first sign that they might actually survive the mission. As the bomber approached the airfield, ground crews quickly realized something extraordinary had happened. The B-17 coming toward them was barely recognizable. Its once smooth metal surface was riddled with holes. Sections of the aircraft were shredded by gunfire. Pieces of the fuselage had been torn open during the battle. Yet somehow it was still flying. Zeamer carefully guided the aircraft down toward the runway. Even landing the bomber was dangerous, since the damaged systems might fail during the final moments of flight. But after everything the crew had endured, the aircraft touched down safely on the runway. When the engines finally shut down, rescue teams rushed toward the bomber. Medical personnel quickly helped the wounded crew members out of the aircraft. The sight inside the plane shocked many of the people on the ground. Bullet holes covered nearly every section of the aircraft. Some areas had been struck dozens of times. By some estimates, the bomber had absorbed hundreds of rounds during the battle, yet it had survived. News of the incredible fight spread rapidly through the air bases across the Pacific. A single bomber had faced a large formation of Japanese fighters and managed to escape after nearly 45 minutes of continuous combat. The crew completed their reconnaissance mission, gathered vital photographic intelligence, and returned with information that would help future operations. What had happened in the sky above Bougainville quickly became one of the most extraordinary aerial battles of the war. In recognition of their courage and sacrifice, the crew received some of the highest honors awarded during World War II. Captain Jay Zeamer was awarded the nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor, for his extraordinary leadership and determination to keep the aircraft flying despite his severe wounds. The same honor was also awarded to Joseph Sarnowski for his heroic defense of the aircraft during the battle. His actions in the nose gun position had protected the cockpit and given the crew the chance to survive the attack. Other members of the crew were also recognized for their bravery, earning high decorations for their roles in one of the most intense air battles fought by a bomber crew in the Pacific. As for the aircraft itself, the battered B-17 that mechanics once called cursed had become something very different. The plane that once sat abandoned in a boneyard had proven itself in the most extreme test imaginable. Against overwhelming odds, it had carried its crew through a battle with numerous enemy fighters and returned home. From that day forward, the story of Old 666 became a legend among bomber crews. It was a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely machines and the most unconventional crews could achieve the most extraordinary victories. In the skies of the Pacific, a forgotten aircraft and a determined group of airmen had written one of the most remarkable chapters of aerial combat history.